The Somali people are one of Africa's largest ethnic groups. With a total population of about 25.8 million, most live in Somalia and/or the unrecognized Republic of Somaliland. If we limit ourselves to just the Somali diaspora elsewhere in the Horn of Africa, that still means roughly 7.3 million Somalis live outside these two relatively homogeneous states in what is known as Greater Somalia. This concept isn't exactly new though, with some tracing the idea back to the Dervish movement of the early 20th century. Anyway, Greater Somalia includes Somalia itself, Somaliland, most of Djibouti, eastern Ethiopia, northeastern Kenya, and sometimes even Yemen's Socotra archipelago. Over time, the concept became intertwined with one of the many isms out there, Somali nationalism, a movement which envisions unifying these areas to form a single nation-state. And in 1977, the newly established Somali Democratic Republic would fight a war with Ethiopia to make this a reality. Things didn't exactly work out, however, and this ultimately led to a decades-long civil war that tore apart Somalia, but still the concept of a Greater Somalia remains popular even today. And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in this video. Okay, first things first, I think we have to define a term here, irredentism. This refers to a territorial dispute in which one state desires to annex territory from another. Non-state actors, though, arguably can engage in irredentism as well. The term itself is derived from the Italian word irredento, meaning unredeemed, and originally was associated with a political movement during the late 1800s and early 1900s that aimed to detach territories in the Austro-Hungarian Empire inhabited by ethnic Italians. These territories would thereafter be redeemed by Italy. While ethno-nationalism often is the main reason for irredentist claims, there of course can be other factors, such as a territory historically belonging to another state. Some examples of irredentism include Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938, Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands in 1982, and more recently Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. You also will often see the word greater applied to various irredentist projects. There's a Greater Argentina, Bangladesh, Hungary, India, Morocco, Serbia, Russia. I think you get the point. Anyway, the idea of a unified Somali nation-state dates back as far as the Dervish movement in the early 20th century, when Muhammad ibn Abdallah Hassan, a religious leader, launched a jihad or holy war to establish a system of government in keeping with the strict principles of the Salihi order of Sufi Islam. This particular order, known for its Islamic Puritanism, was originally founded in Sudan and remains prevalent in Somalia and parts of Ethiopia. Hassan's call for the expulsion of the British, Italians, and Ethiopians eventually garnered support from Somali clans across the region, and soon the so-called Dervish movement attracted roughly 25,000 followers. The word dervish is actually derived from a Persian word which refers to a person or group of people that rely off the giving of alms to survive, and has the same meaning as the Arabic word fakir. Over time, however, the word came to specifically denote members of a Sufi religious order and/or those who belonged to a militant Islamic movement, such as those who followed Muhammad Ahmad bin Abdullah, aka the Mahdi, over in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Much like the Sudanese, the dervishes over in Somalia were able to establish an unrecognized state before Hassan later died in 1921 due to either malaria or influenza, which effectively brought an end to the movement. However, the desire for a unified Somali nation-state remained and even went on to play a role in Italy's colonial ambitions. Following World War I, the United Kingdom agreed to transfer a portion of the Juba Land Protectorate to Italy as a reward for Rome having allied itself with the Entente. This resulted in creation of a short-lived Italian colony called Transjuba that later was absorbed into Italian Somaliland. Then, after the rise of Benito Mussolini and conquest of Ethiopia in 1937, Italy reorganized its colonial possessions, forming Italian East Africa. This included an enlarged Somalia governorate, which was given the Somali-majority Ogaden region. Shortly after the onset of World War II, during August 1940, Italy occupied British Somaliland. This newly acquired territory was then absorbed into the Somalia Governorate. Following this, Mussolini is reported to have told a group of Somali leaders in Rome for a diplomatic visit that Italy was on its way to realizing their dream of a greater Somalia. In mid to late 1940, Italian forces would also make a series of incursions into British East Africa and French Somaliland. However, the British controlled the Suez Canal and were therefore able to isolate Italian forces. In spring 1941, the British regained control of British Somaliland and quickly thereafter conquered the rest of Italian East Africa in what technically was the first major victory of the Allies during World War II. Italian Somaliland was then placed under British military administration, and in 1948, London transferred the Ogaden region to Ethiopia. In his first post-war visit to the region, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia announced the Somali people were by race, color, blood, and customs members of the great Ethiopian family. In keeping with this, use of the Amharic language was encouraged, and the emperor dismissed the possibility of Ogaden joining any future independent Somali nation-state. He did keep open the possibility of Somalis from elsewhere becoming part of the Ethiopian Empire, though. Meanwhile, the former Italian colony of Somaliland was made a United Nations Trust territory and would remain so until July 1, 1960, when it unified with the newly independent state of Somaliland, forming the Somali Republic. Mogadishu thereafter intensified efforts to reunify with missing Somali territories and began providing support to separatist groups in Ethiopia. This laid groundwork for a 1963 uprising in Ogaden, which at one point saw Somali rebels, known locally as Nasr Allah, meaning victory of God in Arabic, take control of nearly 70% of the region. Ethiopia was able to regain control of Ogaden with relative ease, but after doing so, it launched a number of punitive raids against Somali targets on both sides of the border. This, alongside a brutal crackdown of Somalis in-country, eventually resulted in a separate conflict with Somalia. The 1964 Ethiopian-Somali border war, also known as the First Ogaden War, started out with a series of skirmishes along the country's roughly 932-mile-long border. This, however, soon escalated in early 1964 with a series of battles taking place in the Haud. Following mediation by Sudan, a peace agreement was signed on April 2nd, leading to a cessation of hostilities. However, as the 1964 Ethiopian-Somali border war came to a close, another conflict was ongoing in Kenya's northern frontier district. Okay, remember when the British awarded Italy part of the Jubaland Protectorate? Well, the United Kingdom retained control of the other half, which eventually became part of British East Africa. This region, nonetheless, was predominantly inhabited by ethnic Somalis. That fact was not lost upon officials back in Mogadishu, who, in November 1961, passed a resolution welcoming unification between the NFD and Somali Republic. Jomo Kenyatta, leader of the Kenya African Union, a political organization then advocating for Kenya's independence, dismissed this, fearing that concession would jeopardize Kenya's territorial integrity and inspire other secessionist groups elsewhere. The British colonial secretary nevertheless opted to establish an independent commission to assess public opinion in the NFD. According to a report subsequently published by the commission, 62% favored secession with the goal of future unification with the Somali Republic, while a small minority, mainly composed of non-Muslim communities in the NFD, favored unity with Kenya. On November 22, 1963, the British, however, declared that there would be no altering Kenya's frontier without the decision of a new Kenyan government. The rebellion that followed was to the separatists a struggle for self-determination. To the Kenyan government, the separatists were Shifta, a Swahili word meaning bandits or outlaws. Either way, the Shifta War or Gaf Daba officially began in late November 1963 when rebels, secretly trained by the Somali National Army, attacked a camp in Garissa, killing several policemen. On December 28th, Nairobi declared a state of emergency and soon employed a tactic the British had previously used against the Kikuyu people of central Kenya during the Mau Mau Rebellion: villagization. This tactic involved forcing the nomadic pastoralist Somali population of the NFD into fortified villages called Manyata, which some later compared with concentration camps. Anybody found outside these villages was considered a rebel. In keeping with this, a number of search and destroy operations were launched to hunt down rebels and their sympathizers. Kenyan forces would also confiscate or kill any livestock they discovered. The rebels, who initially limited themselves to hit-and-run attacks, would in turn change their tactics as well, increasingly using landmines and rudimentary improvised explosive devices against the better-armed Kenyan military. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but some estimate that over 10,000 people, mostly Somali non-combatants, may have died in the Shifta War. Ultimately, a change in government over in Somalia resulted in Mogadishu suspending its material support for rebels in the NFD. This, alongside diplomatic negotiations overseen by the Organization of African Unity, the precursor to the modern African Union, eventually resulted in the signing of a ceasefire agreement in October 1967, which effectively brought an end to the Shifta War. Then, in 1969, the Somali Republic became the Somali Democratic Republic, a socialist totalitarian state under the rule of President Major General Mohammed Siad Barre. Nasser Allah, which remained active in Ogaden, would also undergo a transformation and, in 1973, formed the Western Somali Liberation Front, which shortly thereafter opened an office in Mogadishu. Less than a year later, in September 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie was himself overthrown in a coup that ushered in a Marxist-Leninist military dictatorship known as the Derg. Seeking to take advantage of the chaos then ongoing in Ethiopia, Somalia funneled supplies to the WSLF and in July 1977 opted to directly involve itself in taking Ogaden by force. The Somali National Army, working alongside the WSLF, was able to overrun Ethiopian forces and in less than a month of the invasion controlled about 90% of the Ogaden region. Despite their failure to capture Dire Dawa, a strategic city that housed Ethiopia's second-largest airbase, the combined forces of the SNA-WSLF proved victorious in the Battle of Jijiga. However, after this, the Ethiopians were able to halt the Somali advance near Harar. Ethiopia was then saved from defeat and likely permanent loss of territory following an unprecedented intervention by the Soviet Union, which provided nearly $1 billion worth of military supplies and 1,500 Soviet advisors. Moscow, which initially tried to placate both sides, eventually opted to stop the delivery of Soviet arms to Somalia in favor of supporting Ethiopia. Somali commanders calculated that their stockpiles of Soviet military equipment would enable them to wage war for 6 months, and having anticipated that the Soviets might disapprove of the war, their objective was to occupy the whole of the Ogaden region by December 1977 before the suspension of Soviet shipments could have a serious impact on their offensive. The Soviet Union was not the only country that intervened on Ethiopia's behalf during the Ogaden War, however. Cuba sent around 12,000 to 18,000 soldiers, while South Yemen and North Korea offered additional military assistance. What's more, Israel allegedly provided cluster munitions, napalm, and combat aircraft. Somalia, in contrast, received token support from China, Romania, and the United States. This all contributed to a successful Ethiopian counteroffensive on February 1, 1978, which eventually resulted in the recapture of Jijiga on March 6. Recognizing his country's position was untenable, Siad Barre ordered the SNA to retreat back to Somalia that March, and the last significant Somali units left Ethiopia later that month, marking the end of the war. Having repulsed the Somali invasion, Ethiopia proceeded to bomb and strafe Ogaden villages as reprisal for their complicity. This resulted in a mass refugee crisis, and by the early 1980s, the number of refugees in Somalia from the Ogaden region exceeded 1.5 million people. The dream of a greater Somalia was then dealt another blow following the Somaliland War of Independence. This conflict in part led to the collapse of Siad Barre's regime and the de facto independence of Somaliland on May 18, 1991. That same year, a rebel force known as the United Somali Congress captured Mogadishu, and Siad Barre fled in a tank filled with reserves from the Somali Central Bank to Berdubo in southwestern Somalia. From here, the former strongman twice attempted to retake Mogadishu, but unsuccessful in returning to power, he was forced into exile and eventually died of a heart attack in Lagos, Nigeria on January 2, 1995. Somalia itself thereafter spiraled into a still technically ongoing civil war, leaving the dream of a unified Greater Somalia still unrealized. Okay, I'm going to give Greater Somalia a 4 on the Ghost Countries Index. You know what, maybe more like a 4.5. Even though it seems unlikely now, with Ogaden rebels having signed a ceasefire back in 2018, the ongoing civil conflict in Ethiopia could always see another conflict in the region sometime. But, as always, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon for helping us do what we love, and if you'd like to help the channel too, there's a link in the description.